Dominic Veretti had bought judges, buried enemies, and built an empire on silence and fear. But tonight, with a billion-dollar deal hanging by a thread, the most dangerous man in Manhattan needed something no amount of money had ever purchased: a woman who couldn't be broken. He never expected her to show up carrying a battered sewing kit and a mouth sharper than any blade he'd ever held. He never expected her to look at him like he was the problem in the room. If this story hits you somewhere real, drop your city in the comments below and hit that like button. Let me see how far this story travels. The rain came sideways off the Hudson that night, the kind that didn't care about umbrellas or expensive coats, or the particular suffering of men who believed weather should respect them. It hit the glass walls of the Veretti penthouse, 73 floors above Manhattan, and ran in crooked lines, distorting the lights of the city below into something that looked almost like a painting, something beautiful viewed from far enough away that you couldn't smell the rot underneath. Dominic Veretti stood at that glass with a glass of scotch he hadn't touched and stared at nothing. He was 41 years old. His face had been described in 3 separate federal indictments as of Mediterranean descent, prominent jawline, notable scar above the left eyebrow. The scar came from his father. Most things about Dominic came from his father. That was the part he never discussed, and the part that explained almost everything. The penthouse was 6,200 square feet of steel and marble and absolute silence. No music. Dominic didn't trust sound he hadn't chosen himself. The staff had learned not to speak unless spoken to. The bodyguards stationed at every exit had learned not to breathe too loudly. Even Ronan Vale, who had been at Dominic's right hand for 11 years and was therefore the closest thing Dominic had to a friend, stood near the bar with his hands behind his back and his eyes on the floor. "You told her 8 o'clock, Dominic said without turning. "I told her 8 o'clock, Ronan confirmed. "It's 8:14. "Yes." Dominic set the untouched scotch on the windowsill. "And you're defending this because—" "I'm not defending anything," Ronan cleared his throat. "She's not easy to tell things to." The elevator chimed. Dominic turned. The doors opened and Alara Whitmore walked into his life carrying a battered canvas sewing kit the size of a small suitcase, wearing a vintage coat the color of burnt sienna that had probably cost $40 at a Brooklyn second-hand shop and looked better than anything the last 3 women he'd dated had worn to formal events. She was 34 years old. Her hair was pulled back with what appeared to be a pencil, an actual pencil, still tucked behind her ear as though she'd been sketching something in the elevator and simply forgot to remove it. She was not beautiful in the way that powerful men expected women to be beautiful. She was beautiful in a way that was harder to dismiss and more difficult to forget. She looked at the room. She looked at the guards. She looked at Dominic. "You're taller than I expected," she said. "Most men who need their egos managed are shorter." Behind Dominic, he heard Ronan make a sound that was not quite a cough. "You're late," Dominic said. "I had a dress to finish. Someone else's crisis." She set the sewing kit on the marble floor without ceremony and looked around the space with the eyes of someone cataloging light sources and fabric drape and the particular way a room's architecture controlled where people stood. It was an occupational habit. She had spent 15 years designing costumes for Broadway productions, and she looked at every space the way a military commander studied terrain, quietly, quickly, and with total focus. Ronan said there was a ruined gown. Ronan told you part of the situation? She looked at Dominic directly, not defiantly, not submissively, just directly, the way a person looked at something they were assessing with professional detachment. "What's the rest?" Dominic studied her for 3 seconds. He had a gift for reading people. Not the theatrical kind of reading that crime bosses in movies performed with narrowed eyes and pregnant pauses, but the real kind. The kind that came from spending childhood in a household where misreading the room meant pain. He read people the way other men read spreadsheets. Fast, without sentimentality, looking for the number that didn't fit. Nothing about Alara Whitmore was performing for him. That was unusual. That was in fact something he could not immediately categorize. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand. My back's been bothering me and chairs make it worse." She pulled the pencil from behind her ear and tucked it into the kit without looking. "What's the situation?" Dominic walked to the center of the room and stopped 6 feet from her. In his experience, proximity was a form of language. Men moved toward him or away from him, and that movement told him everything. Alara Whitmore stood exactly where she'd been standing, like someone who had simply decided that 6 feet was a perfectly acceptable conversational distance and had no particular feelings about him closing it. "I need a wife," he said. The silence held for exactly 1 beat. "Is that a business problem or a personal one?" she asked. "Business." "Then you need to explain it like a business problem." He did. He explained it the way he explained everything, without decoration, without softening, with the particular bluntness of a man who had discovered early that most people spent most of their time obscuring what they actually meant, and he had no patience for it. Salvatore Belluno was 73 years old, the head of a financial empire that stretched from Zurich to Singapore and operated in the kind of legitimacy that could transform Dominic's entire operation from a criminal enterprise into something that looked, on paper, like a multinational holding company. The deal was worth $1.2 billion and 11 years of restructuring. Belluno had agreed to every term except one. The old man believed in family, not as sentiment, as evidence of character. He had watched too many brilliant, ruthless young men burn their empires to ash because they had no anchor, no reason to think past the next victory, no one to make them cautious. He had told Dominic, directly and without apology, that he would not finalize an alliance with a man who had no one to protect. He was hosting a dinner at his estate in 3 days. He expected to meet Dominic's wife. Alara listened to all of this without interrupting. When Dominic finished, she was quiet for a moment, her eyes tracking something on the middle distance that wasn't actually there, the look of someone constructing something internally, turning a problem over to examine its angles. "And the women before me," she said, "didn't work out." "Why?" Dominic crossed his arms. "They performed." "Meaning?" "Meaning they tried to be what they thought I wanted them to be." His jaw tightened slightly. Belluno is 73 years old. He has spent 50 years watching people perform for him. He will see through anything that isn't real in approximately 30 seconds. Alara looked at him for a long moment. "So you need something that looks real." "I need something that is real enough that it doesn't fall apart under examination by one of the most suspicious and experienced men on the eastern seaboard." "How much?" $2 million. She didn't flinch. She also didn't agree. She pressed her lips together and looked down at the floor for a moment, a gesture that Dominic would later understand was not indecision, but calculation. She was doing the math not of money, but of risk, of what this would cost her in categories that didn't have dollar signs. "1 night?" she said. "The dinner. 4 hours, possibly 5. "And afterward?" "You walk out, you take the money. We never speak again." Alara looked up. "What if it falls apart at the dinner? What if Belluno asks a question neither of us can answer? You don't build a real marriage in 3 days, Veretti." The use of his last name without title or hesitation registered somewhere Dominic didn't examine immediately. "That's why I need someone who can think," he said, "not someone who can smile." She breathed out slowly through her nose. The rain hit the glass behind Dominic and ran in those crooked lines, the city below them both doing whatever the city did, surviving, eating itself, producing the endless, low-level desperation that kept men like Dominic in business. "I'll need full background information, not just your name and your cover story, everything. Where you grew up, what your mother cooked, what you were like at 20, what you're afraid of." She watched his face change slightly at the last item and didn't blink. Because if Belluno asks your wife what frightens you, and she doesn't know, that's the moment the whole thing dissolves. "I don't discuss," "Then we're done here." She reached for her sewing kit. Dominic's hand moved before his brain issued the instruction, landing on the canvas strap. Not grabbing, just stopping. His fingers on the worn fabric, his eyes on her face, which was doing nothing dramatic. No flash of triumph, no fear, just that same level directness. "You don't walk away from me," he said. His voice was quiet. That was when it was most dangerous, and most of the people in his life knew it. Alara looked at his hand on her bag, then at his face. "Then don't give me a reason to." She waited. "I'm not one of your employees. I'm not one of your enemies. You came to me through your cousin because you need something I can provide. That means we're doing this as equals or we're not doing it." The word hung in the space between them. Equals. It was a word Dominic Veretti had not used in genuine terms in approximately 11 years. He released the strap. She didn't move, didn't reclaim the bag in a theatrical show of reclaiming power, just stood there. 3 days, he said finally. I need 2 of them. For what? For building a history that will survive scrutiny. She pulled a small notebook from the interior pocket of the burnt sienna coat. She seemed to have an entire organization system contained within it, and clicked a pen. We need a story, not a lie. A story. There's a difference. A lie is something you have to remember. A story is something you believe. Dominic looked at her for a long moment. In his life, he had met strategists, tacticians, lawyers, fixers, and people whose specific gift was making complicated problems disappear. What he had not, until this moment, met was someone who understood the architecture of deception the way a costume designer understood it. From the inside out, from the specific truth that what people believed about a person had more power than the person themselves. He sat down. He began to talk. It took 90 minutes. Dominic told her things about himself he had told no one, not because the information was operationally sensitive, but because no one had ever asked the right questions in the right sequence. Alara asked them the way a seamstress fit a garment, not starting with the finished image, but with the body underneath, the real measurements, the particular asymmetries that had to be accounted for before anything beautiful could be constructed. She asked about his father. She asked about the scar. She wrote in her notebook with the density and speed of someone used to capturing details quickly, like a costume designer backstage between acts, logging alterations before the light changed. Dominic found himself talking about his mother for the first time in years, about the house in South Brooklyn, about the smell of the kitchen in winter. Things that had nothing to do with the Balloon deal and everything to do with who he actually was beneath the tailored suit and the deliberately cultivated silence. He stopped himself mid-sentence and looked at her. You're good at that, making people talk? She didn't look up from her notebook. Actors do it. Designers do it. Everyone's terrified of being seen and desperate for it at the same time. You just have to make the space feel safe enough. She glanced up briefly. Don't read into it. I do this with everyone. He wasn't sure he believed her. He wasn't sure why that mattered. She left at midnight with the notebook and a handshake. She refused a contract until she'd had 24 hours to build the story framework because she said she couldn't commit to a character she hadn't fully designed yet. Dominic stood at the elevator and watched her go. Ronan materialized at his shoulder. Well, Ronan said, she'll do it? You're sure? She's already doing it. Dominic watched the elevator doors close. She's been doing it since she walked in. Ronan was quiet for a moment. She called you taller than expected. Yes. Most people in this building are afraid to make eye contact with you. I noticed. Ronan looked at his employer. Something passed across his face that was not quite concern and not quite satisfaction. Be careful, he said. Dominic turned away from the elevator and walked back toward the window in the rain and the untouched scotch. I'm always careful. No, Ronan said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. You're always in control. That's different. But the next 48 hours had a quality that Dominic could not quite name and would not have admitted to naming if he could. Alara Whitmore arrived at the penthouse each morning at 9 sharp. No longer late, as though the first night had been a test of whether lateness would be tolerated, and having established that it wouldn't particularly matter either way, she'd simply decided 9 was more efficient. She arrived with the notebook, with additional notebooks, with sketches and timelines and a laminated card she made him memorize that contained the 17 most likely questions Belluno or his associates might ask a new wife, annotated with the specific details they needed to agree on. She was not warm, exactly. She was precise. There was a difference that Dominic appreciated. He had grown up with warmth deployed as a weapon. The soft voice before the hard blow, the affection that preceded demand. Alara's precision was, paradoxically, more comfortable. She told him what she thought. She corrected him when he got details wrong. When he said their fictional first meeting had occurred at a gallery opening in Chelsea, she said, that's the kind of place people say they met when they want to sound sophisticated, but didn't actually meet anywhere interesting. Where's somewhere you actually go? I don't go anywhere. She looked at him flatly. You eat. Peter Luger's, Thursdays. Good. We met at the bar at Peter Luger's. You were rude to me, and I made you apologize before I gave you my number. She wrote it down. That's a story. That's a story because it sounds like both of us. On the second day, she arrived with a roll of fabric samples and spent 40 minutes walking the penthouse, holding swatches against different light sources and muttering to herself in the particular focused way of someone who was genuinely absorbed in a problem. She was designing her own dress for the dinner. Dominic had offered the services of 3 different designers, 2 of whom had dressed multiple first ladies. She had declined without particular drama. I don't wear other people's ideas of who I am, she said. That's the fastest way to feel like a costume. This is a performance. No. She held a deep blue fabric against the window light. A performance is when you pretend to be something you're not. What I'm doing is showing them one true thing about myself in a context they'll find convincing. She looked at the fabric. There's a difference. Actors know the difference. The bad ones don't. Dominic sat in the chair he'd begun to think of as his chair for these sessions. Low-backed, facing the windows, angled so he could see both her and the room behind her simultaneously, and watched her work. He was not a man who watched people easily. Observation, in his world, was tactical. But watching Alara was something else. She moved through the space as though she'd already mentally furnished it to her own specifications and was simply operating within her own design. "What are you afraid of?" he said. She turned. "Excuse me?" "You asked me at the first meeting." He held her eyes. "What are you afraid of?" She was quiet for 3 beats. The rain had finally stopped and the city outside was doing its daytime noise, honking and construction and the specific layered chaos of 8 million people conducting their business. "Invisibility," she said finally. "Not literally. Metaphorically. I'm afraid of becoming so accommodating that I stop taking up space." She turned back to the window. "I spent 5 years making myself smaller for a man who still found me inconvenient. That's not happening again." Dominic said nothing, but something he would not name registered in the part of him that had spent his entire adult life deliberately taking up more space than he needed. The night before the dinner, she called at 10:30. He answered on the second ring. "There's a problem," she said. No preamble, no warmth up. He was, he realized, already becoming accustomed to that. "Tell me." "Belluno's guest list. Ronan sent it over an hour ago." Her voice was steady but moved at a different rhythm than usual. Faster, with the precision of controlled urgency. "Matteo Belluno is going to be there." "The nephew." "That's expected. He studied at Parsons, fashion and design, for 2 years." The silence lasted 1 beat. "He'll know I'm not a socialite," she said. "He'll know exactly what I am the moment I walk in. A working designer, not a billionaire's wife. If he looks at my hands, my posture, the way I assess a garment versus the way I wear one, he won't be a problem." "How do you know?" Dominic looked at the window, at the city, at the particular darkness that came at this hour when the lights were all still on, but something had shifted in the quality of the air. Because Matteo Belluno is a man who wants things from his uncle that he hasn't yet been given. He'll be watching me. He'll be watching Ronan. He'll be watching his uncle's reactions. He paused. "He won't be watching you." She was quiet. "Alara." The name came out of him more easily than he expected. "You have spent 15 years being the person in the room that powerful people don't look at. You know how that works." Another silence. "Yes," she said. "Then use it." She hung up. Dominic set the phone down and stood alone in the 6,200 square foot silence of his penthouse and tried to identify the specific quality of the feeling in his chest that he did not have a name for and had not had occasion to feel in so long that he had begun to suspect he was no longer capable of it. He was still standing there 20 minutes later when Ronan knocked. "Everything's set for tomorrow," Ronan said. "Cars, security, the table is confirmed for 9. "Good." Ronan looked at him. "You should sleep." "I know." "Are you going to?" Dominic turned from the window. "Probably not." He walked toward the hallway. "Ronan." "Yeah." "Tell me something." Ronan waited. "Your cousin." Dominic stopped, didn't turn back. How much of what she says does she actually mean? The pause lasted long enough to be a real answer. "All of it," Ronan said. She's the only person I've ever known who genuinely doesn't say things she doesn't mean. It used to drive her ex-husband absolutely insane. Dominic said nothing to that. He walked to his room, closed the door, lay in the dark with his hands behind his head, and stared at a ceiling he couldn't see and thought about a woman who was afraid of becoming invisible and had spent 15 years being the most important person in every room who no one actually saw. He thought about that for a long time. He was still thinking about it when his phone rang at 2:17 in the morning. Unknown number. He answered anyway. That was one of his habits, answering unknown calls, because in his world, the calls you didn't take were the ones that preceded the worst things. Mr. Varetti. The voice was male, slightly accented, and precise in the way of someone reading from a script they'd memorized. The dinner tomorrow evening. You should know that not everyone attending is there for the alliance. The line went dead. Dominic sat up in the dark and called Ronan and told him to run the full guest list again, every name, every connection, every face, and to have it on his desk by 6 a.m. Then he sat in the dark and thought about the fact that the only person he wanted to call was someone he had known for 48 hours and had no reason to trust. He didn't call her. He told himself that was caution. He was not entirely sure it was. The guest list came back at 5:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before Dominic had asked for it, which meant Ronan had not slept either. Dominic sat at the kitchen counter in a white shirt, no jacket, coffee going cold beside him, and read through the names with the focused stillness of a man who had trained himself to process information without letting his face respond to it. 14 guests. 11 he knew, 2 he knew of. 1 he did not recognize at all, listed simply as K. Marin, Associate, Belluno Group, with no additional notation, no title, no origin city. He circled the name. Then he called Ronan. "The Marin name," he said when Ronan picked up on the first ring. "I'm already on it." Ronan's voice had the particular flatness of a man who had been awake too long and was running on something less comfortable than coffee. Nothing clean. The name appears in 3 Belluno subsidiary filings from the last 2 years, always as a signatory, never as a principal. Meaning someone uses him to sign things they don't want their own name on. That's my read. Dominic set the list down. Outside the kitchen windows, the city was doing its pre-dawn thing. Garbage trucks, delivery vans, the specific gray light that belonged to no particular hour and made everything look like it was waiting for permission to exist. Who made the call last night? Still working on it. The number routed through 3 different carriers. We'll have something by noon. I need it before 8. Then I'll have something incomplete before 8. Incomplete is fine. Incomplete tells me something. Dominic picked up the coffee and drank it cold without reacting. Get me whatever you have. He hung up and sat in the silence for a while. Then he picked up his phone and looked at Alara's number for approximately 30 seconds before he put it back down and went to get dressed. She arrived at 8:15, not 9. He noticed that without commenting on it. She came through the elevator in a different coat, charcoal this time, longer, with a collar she'd turned up against the morning cold, carrying a dress bag over one arm and the canvas sewing kit in the other hand and a coffee cup balanced between her wrist and her forearm, with the practiced ease of someone who transported fragile things for a living. "You look like you didn't sleep," she said when she saw him. "I slept." She looked at his face with the same professional assessment she gave fabric in uncertain light. "For how long?" "Enough." "That's not an answer." "It's the one I'm giving." She set the dress bag over the back of a chair and put the coffee down and turned to face him with her hands on her hips and that particular expression she had, not aggressive, not warm, just steady. The expression of someone who had decided long ago that pretending not to see things was more exhausting than simply seeing them. "What happened?" she said. Not a question. He told her about the call, 2 sentences. She listened without moving. "And you didn't call me," she said. "It was 2 in the morning. I was awake at 2 in the morning. She picked up her coffee. "I was awake at 2 in the morning going over Belluno's public statements from the last decade because I wanted to know how he talks about women and whether I was going to need to navigate that at the dinner." She took a drink. "You should have called me. You're not part of the security operation. I'm part of the dinner." Her voice didn't rise. It just got clearer, the way a signal got clearer when you remove the interference. If someone at that dinner is there for a reason other than the alliance, that affects me. That affects what I do and how I move and what I pay attention to. She set the cup down. Don't manage the information I get access to. I'm not one of your people. I'm aware of that. Then act like it. The silence held for a beat that felt longer than it was. Dominic looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them looked away, and neither of them seemed particularly troubled by the other not looking away. It was a different kind of confrontation than the ones he was used to, which almost always involved someone trying to establish dominance and someone trying to survive it. This was two people who didn't particularly want to dominate each other and were both slightly uncertain what to do with that. "Kay Marin," he said, "does the name mean anything to you?" She frowned. Not performing thinking, actually thinking, the frown coming from concentration rather than drama. There was a Marin, textile import company, operated out of Rotterdam and Geneva. They did some business with a production company I worked with about 4 years ago. The deal fell apart because the sourcing was, there were questions about where the materials were actually coming from. She looked at him. Why? Probably nothing. You don't say probably nothing about things that are actually nothing. She picked up the notebook from inside her coat and opened it. Tell me what you're thinking, he told her. Not everything. Not the specific mechanics of the Belluno deal's financial structure. Not the names of the men Dominic had moved against in the last 18 months to clear the path for this alliance. But the shape of his concern, the silhouette of it, which was that someone had called at 2 a.m. to warn him, and warnings in his world were never gifts. They were leverage being positioned. Someone wanted him off balance walking into that dinner. Elara listened and wrote nothing. She just listened, the notebook open on her knee, pen in hand, not using it. That was something Dominic noticed. She wrote things down when she was planning, and she put the pen down when she was understanding. They were different operations for her. All right, she said when he finished. Then we adjust. The plan doesn't change. The plan adjusts. She looked at him with a patience that had some iron in it. There's a difference. Same destination, different route. If someone is trying to destabilize you tonight, the worst thing you can do is walk in already destabilized. She paused. How do you usually handle pressure? I don't. You don't handle it, or you don't feel it. I contain it. That's not the same as handling it. She closed the notebook. Tonight you need to look like a man who is relaxed because he has nothing to worry about, not like a man who is controlling himself because he has everything to worry about. Those look different. People who've spent their lives reading rooms can see the difference. Dominic looked at her for a moment. Belluno will read the room. Belluno will read you. She met his eyes. That's my point. Ronan arrived at 10 with 2 things, the incomplete file on Kay Marin and an expression Dominic didn't like. The expression was the one Ronan wore when he had information that was worse than expected and had spent the drive over deciding how to frame it. Dominic had known him long enough to see the frame being assembled in real time. The particular set of Ronan's shoulders, the way he looked at the floor for half a second before looking at Dominic, the small, controlled exhale. The Marin name, Ronan said, and put a single printed page on the table. Karl Marin, Dutch national, 51 years old. 3 years ago, he was a logistics consultant for a shipping operation that moved product through the Baltic. The operation got rolled up by Interpol. Marin wasn't charged. Because he cooperated, Dominic said. That's the implication. Then he's someone else's asset. Ronan looked at him. That's the implication. Elara had been sitting across the room pretending to review her notes, which meant she was actually listening with complete attention. She didn't look up, but her pen had stopped moving. Who put him on the guest list? Dominic said. He was added to the confirmed list 6 days ago. Belluno's office sent the update directly. Ronan picked up the page. Either Belluno doesn't know what Marin is, which is possible. The man is 73 and his trust circle is managed by people below him. Or Belluno knows exactly what Marin is, Dominic said, and Marin is there to see what kind of man I am when I'm not expecting to be tested. The room was quiet. Or, Ronan said carefully, someone below Belluno is running something independent. Someone who has access to Belluno's communications and his guest list but is operating without the old man's knowledge. Dominic looked at the page, at the name, at the blank space where a title should have been. The nephew, he said. I can't confirm. Matteo Belluno has been in his uncle's shadow for 12 years. He's 41, same age as me. He's watched his uncle accumulate everything and received exactly as much of it as the old man has decided he deserves. Dominic's voice stayed flat. He's the right age for impatience. He's the right position for access. And he's the right kind of man to believe he's smarter than he is. Ronan said nothing. I need you to confirm it before 6 this evening, Dominic said. I need something more than an implication. I'll have something. Confirmed or denied, not implied. Ronan left. Dominic stood at the table with the single page in his hand, and the feeling in his chest from the previous night was back, different now. Not the unidentified feeling, but something with more edges to it, something that felt like the specific tension of walking on ice and hearing it shift underfoot. You think it's the nephew, Ilara said from across the room. Yes. What's he trying to do? Dominic set the page down. If Matteo Belluno can demonstrate that I'm unstable, that my operation has security problems, that I can't manage a dinner without being compromised, he can argue to his uncle that the alliance is a liability, that Dominic Veretti is a risk that old-world money shouldn't take. He looked at her. Which means tonight is not just a dinner. It was never just a dinner, she said quietly. No. He looked at her. But now it's a test with someone trying to make me fail. She stood, picked up the dress bag. Then we don't fail. She walked toward the secondary bedroom that had become her workspace for the past 2 days. At the door, she stopped and turned. Dominic. The first name. He registered it the same way he'd registered the last name the first night. The specific location of it, the weight. Whatever's coming tonight, she said. Don't hide it from me again, not in real time. If something changes in that room, I need to know the second you know it. She held his eyes. I can't protect what I can't see. She went through the door. Dominic stood in the empty room and looked at the space where she'd been and thought about the word protect in a mouth that was not his. By 4 in the afternoon, the penthouse had transformed into something that occupied the uncomfortable space between a command center and a dressing room. Ronan's security team was running final checks on the Belluno estate's layout. 2 of Dominic's people were parked 2 blocks from the venue. Dominic's driver had already done 2 passes of the route, and in the secondary bedroom, Ilara was finishing a dress she had built in 48 hours from materials she'd sourced from a fabric district supplier in the garment district who owed her a favor. Dominic knocked at 4:30. He didn't wait for an answer. It was his penthouse. But he paused in the doorway long enough to make it a choice rather than an intrusion. She was standing in front of a full-length mirror in the dress. It was deep blue, the color she'd held against the window light 2 days ago and chosen without apparent hesitation. The cut was structured at the shoulder and fluid at the hem, the kind of construction that looked simple until you understood how much work simplicity required. She'd done something at the neckline that directed the eye upward, toward her face, toward the particular steadiness in her expression. She looked like someone who had decided who she was a long time ago and had never found sufficient reason to revisit the decision. Well, she said to his reflection in the mirror. It works, he said. I know it works. She turned to face him. Is that your version of a compliment? Yes. She looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in her face, not softening exactly, but adjusting, like a camera coming marginally into focus. You should put the jacket on, she said. The charcoal one, not the black. I was going to wear the black. The black says you're at a funeral. The charcoal says you're at a negotiation. She turned back to the mirror and picked up a hairpin from the dresser, which is what this actually is. He went to put on the charcoal jacket. Passami. They left the penthouse at 6:45. The car was a black town car, the kind that said money without requiring it to say anything else. Dominic sat on one side, Ilara on the other, and for the first 10 minutes of the drive, neither of them spoke, which was not uncomfortable in the way that silence between strangers was uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people doing their final internal preparations for something difficult. Then Ilara said, Tell me one thing about yourself that I don't know yet. Something real. Dominic looked out the window at the city moving past. I don't sleep well in silence. I need sound. I usually sleep with the television on. What do you watch? Weather reports. She was quiet for a moment. That's lonely, she said. Not unkindly, precisely. Yes, he said, and was surprised to hear himself say it. She looked out her own window. I sleep with every light on, she said. I have since I was 8. My mother thought I was afraid of the dark. She paused. I wasn't afraid of the dark. I was afraid of not being able to see what was in the room. Dominic looked at her profile. The city light moved across her face in the intervals between street lamps, catching the angle of her jaw, the particular set of her mouth. We should hold hands when we walk in, she said without turning. Not immediately. Wait until we're through the main entrance and into the foyer. That's when people look. That's when the picture gets formed. All right. And don't look at me when I'm talking to Belluno. Look at the room. It'll read as confidence rather than anxiety. I know how to read a room. I know you do. She finally turned. I'm telling you what it looks like from the outside when you do it well. She reached across the space between them and straightened his lapel. A quick, sure adjustment. The gesture of someone who had been fixing people's appearances for 15 years and did it without thinking. Her fingers were on the fabric for maybe 3 seconds. You look like what you are, she said. That's the best we can do. Dominic looked at her hand as she withdrew it. What do I look like? She considered. Like someone who spent a long time making sure no one can touch anything important. She met his eyes. Which is convincing for a man who would have a wife, because that's exactly what a man like that would look like before he found someone he'd let in. The car stopped. The Belluno estate was a brownstone on the Upper East Side that had been converted at enormous expense into something that looked like it had always been exactly what it was. Old money that had never needed to announce itself. Warm light in the tall windows. 2 men on the door who were not decorative. Dominic got out first and offered his hand. Alara took it, stepped out, and did not look at the house immediately. She looked at him because that was what a woman who was actually in love with the man she'd arrived with would do. Check in with him before checking the room. It was a perfect instinct. Dominic filed it away. They walked to the door. His hand was at the small of her back. She was warm through the fabric of the dress. He could feel her breathing, steady, even, the breath of someone who is managing something internally and doing it well. The door opened. The foyer was marble and candlelight and the ambient low-level noise of powerful people managing their power in each other's presence. 14 people in a room designed for 12, the space calibrated to produce exactly this level of subtle pressure. Dominic saw Matteo Belluno immediately. 30 feet away, dark suit, his uncle's eyes in a younger face, the specific expression of a man who had been anticipating this arrival and was now cataloging it. His gaze moved from Dominic to Alara with a speed that he probably believed was subtle. Alara's hand found Dominic's forearm, just her fingertips, a light contact, the kind of touch that said, I'm here without saying anything. He covered her hand with his. Salvatore Belluno emerged from the group near the fireplace, moving with the particular deliberateness of a man who had decided long ago that he would never appear to hurry. He was smaller than Dominic expected. Men who commanded that much space in conversation tended to fill the imagination beyond their actual dimensions, with white hair and dark eyes, and the handshake of someone who had used it for 50 years as an intelligence-gathering tool. Mr. Veretti, Belluno said. His English was accented but precise. I have waited some time for this introduction. Mr. Belluno. Dominic held the handshake at the right duration. My wife, Alara. Belluno turned to her. His eyes moved over her face the way Dominic's did when he was actually reading something. Not performing the act of looking, but actually extracting information. Mrs. Veretti, he said, I have been told a great deal about you. Alara smiled. It was not a practiced smile. It was the real one she used when something genuinely amused her, small and direct and slightly asymmetric. I'd be curious what you've been told, she said. Dominic is selectively honest, which means whatever he told you about me is true and what he left out is more interesting. Belluno laughed. Not a polite laugh. An actual one, short and surprised. He looked at Dominic. I see, he said. I see why. They were guided toward the table. Dominic kept his hand at Alara's back. She moved through the room without looking at Matteo, which was, Dominic understood, a form of intelligence. She had identified him and chosen to deny him the acknowledgement. They found their seats. The dinner began. For 40 minutes, it was what it appeared to be. Powerful people eating expensive food and talking about things that were not what they were actually talking about. Belluno asked about Dominic's consolidation in the northeastern shipping channels. Dominic answered in the language of legitimate business with the fluency of a man who had spent 11 years making his operation look like something it was adjacent to, but not identical with. Alara listened and participated, and this was the thing Dominic had not fully anticipated. Participated in a way that was genuinely useful. When a conversation about European financial regulation reached a point of strained technical specificity, she redirected it with a question about craft and design that somehow made Belluno discuss his grandmother's weaving business in Palermo for 7 minutes, while everyone else at the table looked at her the way people looked at someone who had just made something difficult disappear. Dominic watched her do this and felt something that was not quite gratitude and not quite admiration, and was somewhere in the middle of both. Then, across the table, he saw Karl Marin set down his wine glass and look at Alara with the particular focused attention of someone who had just recognized something. And Alara, 2 seconds later, looked at the waiter approaching from the left side of the room. Her hand found Dominic's knee under the table. One brief, deliberate pressure. Not the touch of someone seeking reassurance, the touch of someone issuing a warning. Dominic did not look at the waiter. He looked at Alara's face, which was composed and social, and had somewhere in its absolute stillness the quality of a person who had just registered that something in the room was wrong. Dominic felt it before he understood it. The specific animal alertness that had kept him alive through 11 years of a business where the wrong read of a room meant you didn't walk out of it. It started in his spine, moved upward. His hand found Alara's under the table and covered it, not reassurance, acknowledgement. I see it too. Tell me what you see. Her fingers pressed once against his palm. Then she picked up her wine glass with her right hand and turned to say something light and inconsequential to the woman on her left. And in the pivot of that turn, she clocked the waiter with the full peripheral sweep of someone trained to see a stage from every angle simultaneously. Dominic looked at Belluno. Belluno was listening to Matteo say something about Frankfurt. Belluno's eyes were patient and slightly distant, the eyes of a man who had heard his nephew's opinions on Frankfurt before. Dominic looked at the waiter. Late 30s. The right uniform. The right posture, almost. The jacket fit correctly. The tray was correct. The gloves were correct. What was not correct was the way he moved. Not the efficient choreography of a trained server navigating a crowded table, but the specific controlled stillness of a man trying to move like something he wasn't, executing a physical performance with his head rather than his muscle memory. The way an actor who hadn't rehearsed enough thought about each movement a half second before making it. Alara set her wine glass down. She turned to Dominic and put her hand on his arm and leaned in. And to anyone watching, it was a wife sharing something small and intimate with her husband, the kind of moment that made the whole fabricated history feel true. But what she said, at a volume that reached only him, was, "Left interior jacket pocket. He's been favoring his left side since he came through the door." Dominic didn't look at the pocket. He looked at Alara's face, 2 inches from his, her eyes level with his, completely steady, the breath coming even and controlled through her nose. "How long?" he said, the same intimate register. "He's been circling for 8 minutes. He'll make his move at the table turn, when the main course is cleared." 3 minutes, maybe 4. Dominic looked at Ronan, who was stationed near the entrance to the kitchen corridor, the only one of his people permitted inside the room. A single look. Ronan read it the way he read everything from Dominic, completely, immediately, without requiring it to be spelled out, and shifted his weight almost imperceptibly toward the left wall. "When I stand," Dominic said quietly, "you move right." "I'm not moving anywhere," Alara said. "Alara, I'm the one who saw him." Her voice was a wire, thin and under tension. "If I stand up and move, he reacts early. If I sit here and look like a woman who has no idea anything is happening, he stays on his timeline." She picked up her fork. "I know what I'm doing." He looked at her. At the absolute composure in her face, which cost something. He could see what it cost. The particular set of her jaw, the way she'd moved her shoulders back a millimeter, holding the architecture of her own calm together through what had to be sheer force of practiced discipline. This was what 15 years of backstage theater made a person. This was what it looked like when someone understood that the show happening in front of the curtain depended entirely on the invisible work behind it. "Stay seated until Ronan has him," Dominic said. "Yes." "The moment Ronan moves, you go left. Hard left. Away from Belluno." "I know." "Don't, Dominic." She looked at him with a patience that had heat underneath it. "I've managed costume emergencies during live performances in front of 3,000 people. I know how to move without creating a scene." She met his eyes. "Trust me or don't, but decide now." He decided. He trusted her. He turned back to the table and picked up his own fork and said something to the man on his right about a shipping route through the Gulf of Finland that he didn't care about at all. And the dinner continued, and the waiter circled, and the room did not know that anything was wrong. The main course plates were 3/4 empty when it happened. The waiter came around the left side of the table toward the space between Salvatore Belluno and his guest from Zurich, and his right hand came off the tray, and Dominic was already standing when Ilara's chair scraped back, and Ronan came off the wall with the specific fast efficiency of a man who had rehearsed this kind of moment without knowing when it would actually arrive. What followed was 8 seconds of controlled chaos that looked, to the dinner guests, like an accident, a tray, a stumble, raised voices. The particular alarmed commotion of expensive people encountering disorder. What it actually was. Ronan's left forearm across the waiter's chest, driving him into the wall. Dominic's hand on Belluno's shoulder, a steering gesture that moved the old man back and left. And Ilara, who had gone hard left exactly as instructed, now standing between two of Belluno's other guests with her hands up, and her voice doing something remarkable, calm, authoritative, slightly theatrical, the voice of someone managing frightened people in a confined space, which was something she had, it turned out, literal professional training in. "Everyone stay seated. It's all right. It's all right." The room stayed seated. The waiter did not produce what he'd been reaching for, because Ronan's technique left him with no operational use of his left arm. And 3 seconds later, 2 of Dominic's exterior team were inside, and it was over before most of the table fully understood that something had happened. Salvatore Belluno stood at the edge of the room and looked at his guest with an expression that Dominic had not seen on the man's face in 2 years of preliminary negotiations. Not fear, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a man recalibrating the world he thought he knew. His eyes moved to Ilara. She was speaking quietly to the woman from Zurich, a hand on the woman's arm, the practiced steadiness of someone managing aftermath. Then she looked up and found Belluno looking at her, and she met his gaze without looking away and said nothing, which was the right thing to say. Belluno looked back at Dominic. "Your wife," he said. "Yes," Dominic said. "She saw him first." It was not a question. "Yes," Dominic said again. Belluno was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in Italian, something that Dominic's understanding of the language was just sufficient to catch. Roughly, "She is the real one." Then he turned and spoke quietly to his people, and the room began the particular process of recovering its own dignity. They pulled the man's identity within the hour. Not in the Belluno dining room. That space was evacuated with the kind of smoothly choreographed efficiency that came from Belluno's people, having clearly thought about this contingency before. They moved to a side study, all dark wood and the smell of old paper, and Dominic stood at the center of it with Ronan at the door and Ilara on the leather settee in the corner with her shoes off and her feet tucked under her, still in the dress, still precise, but running on empty now. He could see it in the way she held her shoulders, the specific fatigue of someone who had been at full capacity for 4 hours straight. The man's name was not important. What was important was who sent him. Ronan told them in the flat voice he used for bad news he'd already processed. The device in his jacket was a recording unit, not a weapon. The room was quiet. "He wasn't there to hurt anyone," Ronan said. "He was there to record the dinner, specific conversations, financial terms, names." Dominic looked at him, and then deliver the recording to someone who would use the content to demonstrate that the Belluno-Veretti alliance represented a specific category of criminal conspiracy, the kind that triggers mandatory federal review of both organizations' financial structures. Ronan looked at the floor, the kind that unravels an alliance before it's finalized. Not an assassination, Alara said from the settee. Her voice was quiet. A setup. A setup, Ronan confirmed. Someone wanted the dinner to produce a record, Dominic said. A documented conversation that could be used as leverage or filed as evidence. He looked at Ronan. Who ordered it? Ronan looked at him. Confirmed or not, Dominic said. Confirmed, Ronan said. The recording unit's retrieval protocol was tied to a secure drop managed by a shell company registered in Cyprus 18 months ago. He paused. The shell company has one beneficial owner. It took us 40 minutes to get through the layering. Another pause, the kind that preceded a thing that changed the shape of the evening. Matteo Belluno. The study was quiet. Alara looked at Dominic. He was standing very still, the way he went still when something landed. Not the stillness of shock, because Dominic Veretti's capacity for shock had been surgically removed by his particular upbringing, but the stillness of a man absorbing a new piece of information and immediately beginning to understand all the other pieces it rearranged. His own uncle's dinner, Alara said. His own uncle's dinner, Ronan said. He was willing to expose Belluno to federal scrutiny. He was counting on Belluno not being in the room when the most sensitive conversation happened. The table placement had Belluno stepping out at 9:15 for a call. It was scheduled on the official itinerary. Matteo arranged the itinerary. Ronan set the folder on the side table. The recording would have captured Dominic and the Zurich associate discussing specific transfer mechanisms. Belluno would have had clean hands. Matteo would have had the recording. Leverage, Dominic said. Over you, and over anyone else at that table. He builds a collection. He becomes the man who holds the information. He becomes necessary, Dominic said. He becomes the man you can't move against because he has everything you need buried. The words sat in the room. Alara was looking at her hands. She had a small mark on her right index finger from where she'd gripped the edge of the table when she stood up. A pressure mark, already fading. She was looking at it the way she looked at problems, from the angle that told you where the seam was. He doesn't know we know, she said. Both men looked at her. Matteo, he knows the recording unit was recovered, but he doesn't know we've traced it back to him. His people would have told him the asset was burned, the operation failed. He's sitting somewhere right now recalculating. She looked up. He thinks he has time. Dominic looked at her. How do you know? Because if he knew we had his name, he'd already be moving. He'd be getting ahead of it with his uncle, building a story, deflecting. He's not. Belluno's people would have told us. He's sitting and waiting and wondering how much we know. Ronan looked at Dominic. Dominic looked at Alara. We have a window, she said. A small one, Dominic said. Then we use it before it closes. Salvatore Belluno came to the study at 10:47. He came alone, which was the kind of statement that didn't require words. He was 73 years old, and he moved like a man who had survived 5 decades in a world that did not extend much professional courtesy. And when he came through the door, he looked at Dominic first, and then at Alara, and then he sat down across from them both and folded his hands on the table and said, "Tell me." Dominic told him. He did not soften it. He did not frame it diplomatically or present it gradually or manage the old man's reception of the information. He put it on the table the same way he put everything on the table, completely, flatly, without theater. Belluno listened without expression. This was the face, Dominic understood, of a man who had trained his reactions over 50 years to give nothing away. But when Ronan put the documentation on the table, the shell company filing, the retrieval protocol, the beneficial ownership record with Matteo's name on it, something moved in the old man's face that was not a controlled expression. It was the involuntary thing that happened when information arrived that the body registered before the mind could manage it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in English, "How long have you known?" "Confirmed 40 minutes ago," Dominic said. "Suspected since this morning." This morning, Belluno's voice was completely flat. "I received a call last night, anonymous, telling me the dinner was not what it appeared." "You came anyway." "I came prepared." Belluno looked at the documentation for another long moment. Then he looked at Alara. "You saw the man first." "Yes," she said. "Before my security. Before Veretti's people. I've spent 15 years studying how people move when they're pretending to be something they're not," she said. "It's recognizable." Something shifted in Belluno's face. Not warmth exactly. This was not a warm man. and it would have been false to pretend the moment made him one. But something like recognition, the specific acknowledgement of a capability he respected because he understood its cost. "You are not what I expected," he said to her. "Most people aren't," she said. When they're being looked at honestly. Belluno looked at Dominic. "My nephew," he said. The two words had a weight to them that Dominic recognized, the specific heaviness of a man confronting the fact that someone inside his circle had moved against him, that the loyalty he thought he'd maintained had been a performance given by someone who'd decided their own future was more important. It was a feeling Dominic knew. He had spent his adult life building walls against it. "He wants what you have," Dominic said. "He always has." Belluno's voice was still flat. "I knew this. I believed the wanting was something I could manage." He was quiet. "I was wrong about that." "What do you want to do?" Dominic said. The question sat there. In Dominic's world, this question had one category of answer. You found the person who moved against you, and you removed the threat, comprehensively, in the manner that sent the clearest possible message to the next person who was thinking about moving. Belluno looked at him and seemed to read exactly that calculation in his face. "I did not build what I have," Belluno said carefully, "by making enemies of family." "He made himself your enemy." "Yes." The old man's hands moved on the table. A small adjustment, a deliberate settling. "And I will handle him, in the way that I handle things." He met Dominic's eyes. "Not your way." The sentence had no accusation in it. It was simply a boundary, stated plainly by a man who had the standing to state it. Dominic said nothing. Alara said, "There's something else you should know." Both men looked at her. She had her notebook out. Dominic didn't know when she'd retrieved it. From her bag, presumably, which had been in the study when they arrived. She had it open to a page of notes he hadn't seen her write, and he understood she'd been writing while he and Ronan talked, the habit of a woman who processed information by capturing it. "Carol Marin," she said. "He sat across from me for 2 hours. I watched him watch the room." She looked at Belluno. He wasn't there for Matteo's operation. He didn't know about the recording unit. His reaction when Ronan moved was genuine surprise. He was oriented toward Matteo before anything happened, tracking him, logging his positions and conversations. She set the notebook on the table and turned it so Belluno could see. Names, times, positions in the room, correlations she'd drawn with a line between them. "Marin isn't working for Matteo," she said. "He's watching Matteo. Someone else sent him. Someone who already knew Matteo was running an independent operation and wanted documented evidence of it." The room was very quiet. "Who?" Dominic said. "I don't know. But whoever put Marin in that room wanted the same thing we ended up with tonight. Matteo's operation exposed." She looked at Belluno. "The question is why? And who benefits most from your nephew being removed from your trust circle?" Belluno looked at the notebook, at the lines she'd drawn, at the name Marin connected by a single line to a question mark. "There are people," he said slowly, "who have wanted access to my operation for a long time. People who understood that Matteo was the lever." He paused. "People who would be very pleased to have me weakened, distracted, and indebted to a new partner whose loyalty they could then try to purchase." "They wanted you to turn to Dominic," Alara said. "They wanted Dominic indebted to me for exposing Matteo, and me convinced I needed Dominic's protection." Belluno's eyes moved to Dominic, which would make the alliance not a partnership but a dependency, and a dependency can be managed, Dominic said, by whoever manufactured the crisis that created it. The word landed like something physical. 3 people in a room who had walked into the evening with one set of problems and come out the other side into something considerably more complicated. The alliance under threat not from outside but from within, the threat not contained but now revealed to have a second layer underneath the first, and underneath that layer a question mark that meant someone else was in this game and had been in it long enough to set the board 3 moves ahead. Dominic looked at Ronan. Ronan said nothing. He was looking at the floor with the expression he wore when he'd arrived at a conclusion and was deciding whether this was the moment to say it. "Ronan," Dominic said. Ronan looked up. "The call you received last night," he said. "I finished the trace an hour ago." He paused. It routed through 3 carriers and a VPN chain, but the originating signal came from a device registered to a communications account linked to Belluno Group's internal network. Belluno was very still. "Someone inside your own organization called me," Dominic said, "to warn me about your nephew's operation, to make sure I came to this dinner prepared enough to catch Matteo in the act, so that you would be forced to confront Matteo's betrayal in real time, with me as the witness, making the alliance between us not a business arrangement but a debt," Belluno said. "Yes." Belluno stood. He moved to the window of the study and stood with his hands behind his back and looked out at the street. The posture of a man who needed a moment to let the full weight of something settle before he could respond to it. Dominic watched him. Alara watched Dominic. She had closed the notebook. She was sitting on the edge of the settee now, feet on the floor, heels on, the posture of someone who understood that the next 30 seconds were going to determine something important and wanted to be ready to move. Belluno turned from the window. "I have been in this business for 50 years, he said. "I have been betrayed by partners, by competitors, by government officials. I believed I had purchased completely." He looked at Dominic. "I have never been played from inside my own house." His voice was controlled, but underneath it was something that sounded like the specific anger of a man who prided himself on his intelligence and had just been shown a room he didn't know existed. "Someone inside my organization has been running a strategy against me, using my nephew as a tool, using this dinner as a mechanism." He paused. "Using you." "And you," Dominic said. "Yes." The old man's jaw tightened. "And me." The silence held. "If we finalize the alliance now," Dominic said, "we do it knowing it was manufactured, knowing that whoever is inside your organization wanted this outcome and has been engineering it." He held Belluno's eyes. "That means the alliance itself might be the trap, the endpoint of an operation we don't fully understand yet." Belluno looked at him for a long time. "You would walk away. I'm telling you, we can't sign anything until we know who made that call. And if we never find out, then we have a bigger problem than a billion-dollar deal." Alara stood up. Both men looked at her with the involuntary attention she commanded in rooms when she moved with purpose. "There's one person who knows who made that call," she said. She was looking at the notebook in her hand, not at them. "One person who was in this building tonight and knew about Matteo's operation and knew about the alliance and had access to Belluno Group's internal network." She looked up. "Marin." Dominic looked at Ronan. Ronan was already at the door. "He left 20 minutes ago," Ronan said, in the confusion after the dining room was cleared. He had his phone in his hand. "I have his exit on camera." "Where?" Dominic said. "He walked 3 blocks east, got into a car." Ronan looked at the phone. "The plate is registered to a rental company. We have the rental company." Dominic looked at him. "How long?" 20 minutes, maybe 30. Dominic looked at Belluno. The old man nodded once. Dominic looked at Alara. She was standing with the notebook at her side, her dress still perfect, her face composed, and in her eyes the particular expression of someone who had walked into a situation that was larger than the one they'd agreed to and was deciding, right now, in real time, whether to step back from the edge or step forward. That was what she decided. Not back, not sideways. She looked at the edge and she stepped forward, the same way she'd stepped forward into every situation in her life that was larger than the one she'd prepared for. The opening night, when the lead actress tore her dress 17 minutes before curtain, the contract negotiation with a producer who'd tried to cut her fee after the work was done, the morning she'd packed 2 suitcases and walked out of a marriage that was consuming her one accommodation at a time. "I'm coming with you," she said. "No," Dominic said. "Marin saw me at the table. He knows I was watching him. If your people pick him up and put him in a room, he's going to lawyer up and say nothing for 48 hours. She looked at Dominic steadily. "But if I walk in, he has a different calculation. I'm not a threat. I'm a woman in an evening dress who noticed something at dinner. He'll want to know what I know before he decides what to say." Dominic looked at her for 3 full seconds. "She's right," Ronan said from the door. Dominic said nothing. His jaw moved slightly. Not speaking, just the particular tension of a man running calculations that had emotional variables in them and finding the math unpleasant. "Dominic," she said, "not soft, clear. You either trust me or you don't. You made that call at the dinner table. Don't unmake it now because you're scared. The word landed. He was scared. Not for himself. Fear for himself was something he had metabolized into fuel so many years ago that he barely recognized it as fear anymore. This was different. This was the specific, unfamiliar, and deeply inconvenient fear of something happening to a person who had become, without any formal announcement, important. "You stay behind me," he said. "In front of you," she said. "That's the whole point." The rental car company had an address in Midtown and a night manager who took one look at Ronan's approach and made the correct decision not to ask questions. The car had been returned 40 minutes ago, the renter paying in cash against a deposit. The name on the rental agreement, one of 4 aliases Marin apparently maintained, all of which Ronan's contact burned through in 12 minutes on a laptop in the rental office's back room, while Dominic stood at the window and watched the street, and Alara sat on the edge of the manager's desk and took her heels off and put them in her bag. "What are you doing?" Dominic said without turning. "I'm not chasing anyone in 3-inch heels," she said. "You're not chasing anyone at all." She put on the flat shoes she'd apparently been carrying in the bag all evening, the small, folded ballet flats that costume designers and actresses kept on their persons the way other people kept aspirin. "Whatever you say," she said, which was not agreement. Ronan came out of this back room. Marin checked into a hotel on Lex 2 hours before the dinner. Paid cash. The credit card on file is the alias. He held up the phone with a hotel name on it. "Room 714. Night staff changes at midnight. It's 11:42. Dominic looked at him. "How many?" "2 of our people are already outside. Lobby has 1 camera blind spot. Service entrance, left of the elevator bank." Ronan looked at Alara. "She goes in the main entrance. She's not armed. Marin's people, if he has any in the hotel, will see a woman in an evening dress and read tourist or event, not threat." "Marin's people," Alara said. "How many does he travel with?" "Unknown. The rental was a single occupancy. He had a briefcase and a coat." Ronan looked at Dominic. "My read is he travels alone. Men who operate as information assets usually do. A team creates a signature." "Usually," Dominic said. "Usually," Ronan confirmed. Dominic looked at the street. At the particular 1142 quality of Midtown, still moving, still lit, the specific New York energy that never fully stopped but changed register after midnight into something rawer and less managed. He looked at the hotel name on Ronan's phone. He looked at Ilara's face. "You go in first," he said. "Lobby. The bar if there is one. Find a seat with a line of sight to the elevator. Text Ronan when you're positioned. Do not go above the ground floor under any circumstances. Do you understand me?" "Yes." "I mean it. I understood you the first time." She picked up the small bag. "What's my reason for being there if someone asks?" "Event ran late. You're meeting your husband." She looked at him. Something passed across her face that was quick and complicated and was gone before he could name it. "All right," she said. She walked out. Dominic watched her go through the glass front of the rental office, watched her cross the sidewalk and flag a cab with the practiced ease of someone who had navigated this city alone for 20 years, watched the cab take her east toward Lex, and felt the particular cold clarity of a man who has just committed to a course of action he cannot take back and knows it. "She'll be fine," Ronan said. "I know," Dominic said. "You don't sound like you know." "Let's go." What? The hotel bar had 11 people in it at 11:49, which was the right number. Enough that a woman alone in an evening dress didn't read as unusual. Not enough that positioning was complicated. Alara found a seat at the bar's far end with a diagonal view to the elevator bank and ordered a club soda from a bartender who looked at the dress and the flat shoes and the canvas bag and made no visible judgment, which was the specific professionalism of good hotel bar staff. She texted Ronan, "Positioned, bar, clear line elevators, no visible security." Then she put the phone face down on the bar and breathed and looked at the lobby with the same eyes she used to read a stage before a performance, cataloging exits, traffic patterns, the specific body language of people in transition spaces who were either going somewhere or waiting for someone or doing what she was doing, which was watching. The elevator opened at 11:53. Carol Marin came out alone. Briefcase. Same jacket from dinner. Collar. Now open. The tie removed and the first button undone. A man who had returned to his room, had an incomplete decompression, and had come back down for the reason men in his situation often did. He needed to think somewhere that wasn't the contained space of a hotel room, and bars provided a specific quality of anonymity that felt like cover even when it wasn't. He went to the opposite end of the bar. He ordered something dark, neat. He set the briefcase on the stool beside him, the specific claim of a man ensuring no one sat next to him. He looked at his phone for 30 seconds, put it face down on the bar, and looked at the bottles behind the bartender with the unfocused gaze of someone processing. Alara picked up her club soda and walked to his end of the bar and sat down 2 stools away from the briefcase. She didn't look at him. She looked at her phone, opened a note application, and began writing something with the focused downhead attention of someone doing actual work. Her pen, she had found the pencil in her bag, the one from the first night, moving across the screen's edge to an actual small notebook she'd pulled out, sketching something that was actually a technical sketch of a sleeve alteration she'd been thinking about for 3 days and hadn't had time to address. She was aware of the exact moment Marin looked at her. It was 40 seconds after she sat down. She felt it the way you felt being looked at in a quiet room, the specific quality of attention that had a direction to it. She didn't look up. He looked away. She finished the sleeve sketch and turned to a new page and wrote 4 words in the margin. "He knows I'm here." Then she picked up her club soda and turned and looked at him directly. He looked back. His face was controlled. He was a man who controlled his face for a living. "You were at the dinner," she said. Not accusing, just factual, the way you'd note weather. A pause. "Yes," he said. In English, his accent slight, Dutch underneath it. "Long night," she said. "Yes." She looked at her glass. "You watched my husband more than you watched anyone else at the table." She said husband without hesitation, without the internal quotation marks, because the story was real enough now that it didn't require performance. "And you watched Matteo Belluno." She looked up. "I'm a costume designer. I watch people for a living. You were logging positions." Marin was very still. "I'm not here to threaten you," she said. "My husband is 6 minutes behind me and he's considerably less patient than I am. But right now it's just me and a club soda, and I'm asking you a simple question because I think you actually want someone to ask it." She met his eyes. "Who sent you?" The bar noise continued around them, ice in glasses, the television above the bottles showing something without sound, the bartender at the far end polishing something. Marin looked at her for a long time. Then he picked up his drink and said, "You have no idea the size of what you're in the middle of." "Then tell me," she said, "because right now I'm operating on partial information, and that's more dangerous for everyone than the full picture." Dominic came through the service entrance at 11:57 with Ronan and one other, and found the lobby elevator without incident, and reached the bar at 3 minutes past midnight and stopped in the entrance. Alara was sitting 2 stools from Karl Marin, and they were talking, not performing a conversation. Actually talking, Marin leaning forward slightly, his briefcase now on the floor instead of the stool, his body language reorganized from closed and defensive to something that was not open exactly, but was no longer sealed. Alara with the notebook on the bar, writing something he was apparently saying, the pencil moving in short, quick notations. Ronan made a sound beside Dominic that was almost a laugh. Dominic walked to the bar. Marin saw him coming, and his body went through a quick internal sequence. The threat assessment flinch, the calculation, the recalibration, and then he sat very still and looked at Dominic with the specific face of a man who has decided that whatever happens next, running is the wrong answer. Dominic sat down on the other side of Alara. She didn't look up from the notebook. "Carol was about to tell me who inside Belluno's organization made the call to your phone last night." Dominic looked at Marin. Marin looked back. "You understand," he said carefully, "that what I tell you creates a problem for me with the people I work for." "I understand," Dominic said, "and you're going to tell me that becomes my problem." "I'm going to tell you that your problem right now is that you're in a hotel bar in Midtown, and I know your 4 aliases and your room number and the name of the shell company you use in Cyprus. And the question of what happens to you tonight is a variable, not a constant." Dominic's voice was completely flat. "The people you work for are not in this building. I am." Marin looked at his drink, at the bar's surface, at Alara's notebook, where she had stopped writing and was waiting with the pencil poised. "There's a man named Harlan Voss," Marin said. "He's not at Belluno Group. He's adjacent to it, a financial intermediary who has handled specific structures for Belluno for 15 years. Legitimate work, mostly. Clean hands. He paused. Voss has been positioning for 3 years to bring the Belluno operation under a new umbrella structure, a holding entity that would consolidate 3 legacy European networks under one financial governance framework. Another pause. He needed Belluno destabilized, not destroyed, destabilized, weakened enough to accept a partner he would otherwise never need. And Matteo, Dominic said. Matteo approached Voss 2 years ago. He wanted help accelerating his uncle's retirement. Voss gave him tools, the Cyprus entity, the communications routing, the access to assets like me. Marin's jaw tightened slightly. Matteo believed he was using Voss to get to his uncle. Voss was using Matteo to set up exactly what happened tonight. Dominic looked at him. Voss wanted Matteo exposed. Voss wanted Belluno to watch his own nephew betray him in front of the one man Belluno was considering as a new partner. He wanted Belluno shaken, humiliated, and in debt to you. Then he intended to come to you with a proposition. Marin finally looked directly at Dominic. Voss is the man who called you last night. He used Belluno's internal network because he has access to it, has had access for 3 years. The bar continued its ambient life around a silence that occupied 3 stools and a notebook. Where is he? Dominic said. New York. He's been here for 10 days. Marin reached into his jacket pocket. Dominic's hand moved. Ronan's moved faster. And Marin stopped and said, It's a card. And waited. And Ronan reached in and took it. A hotel card. Different hotel. Name printed below the logo in small type. He's expecting to hear from me tonight, Marin said. He'll want confirmation that the operation ran correctly, that you and Belluno are shaken and positioned for his approach. He looked at Dominic. He doesn't know I'm here. How long before he does? When I don't call. An hour. Maybe less. Dominic stood. He looked at Alara. She had closed the notebook and was looking at the card in Ronan's hand with the focused expression of someone who had just watched a set of pieces arrange themselves into a picture. You knew, she said to Marin. Not accusing, checking. Marin looked at her. I suspected. Tonight confirmed it. You came to the dinner to confirm it, and then I needed someone to give it to. He looked at his drink. Voss is not... What he's building is not something I agreed to be part of when I took this work. There are lines. He paused. I have a few left. Alara looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Dominic. Dominic was already thinking 4 moves ahead. She could see it. The particular stillness that was actually high-speed internal processing. The jaw slightly set. The eyes not focused on anything in the room, but on some interior map he was drawing and redrawing in real time. Voss is expecting a call, Dominic said, which means Voss can receive one. Ronan looked at him. You want to... I want to give him what he's waiting for. Dominic looked at Marin. Can you make the call sound right? I've been making things sound right for 12 years, Marin said. Then you're going to call Voss and tell him the operation succeeded, that Belluno is shaken, that I'm in the wind, running damage control, disorganized. Dominic picked up the hotel card. And then we're going to go have a conversation with Harlan Voss before he has time to understand that tonight didn't go the way he planned. They went in 3 cars because Dominic didn't want a convoy and he didn't want anyone going in alone. Marin rode with Ronan, which was not comfortable for anyone involved but was the only configuration that made sense. Marin was the asset and the liability simultaneously, the one piece on the board that could not be left unsupervised and could not be discarded. Alara rode with Dominic. She had the notebook open on her knee and was writing in it with the pencil, the scratch of graphite on paper, the only sound in the car beyond the engine and the street. And Dominic looked at her hands moving and felt the specific quality of the moment. The city outside, the speed, the destination, the thing waiting at the destination. And also this. A woman writing in a notebook in a car at midnight, shoes off again, dress still intact, pencil moving. What are you writing? He said. What Marin told me. While it's still precise. She didn't look up. Memory degrades under stress. I write things down. You wrote during the dinner. I write all the time. She turned a page. It's how I think. A pause. What are you going to do when you find Voss? Talk to him. She looked up then. And after the talking? He looked out the window. That depends on what he says. Dominic. Her voice was quiet but had something under it. Not warning, not judgment. Concern. The real kind, the kind that came from someone who was actually in the situation with you rather than observing it from outside. He's not Matteo. He's not someone who made a power play inside a family structure. He spent 3 years engineering a situation to make me a debt-ridden instrument of his consolidation strategy, Dominic said. His voice was still flat, but underneath it was the specific heat of a man who contained his anger the way a pressure vessel contained steam. He used a man's nephew against him. He used my alliance as a mechanism. He called me at 2 in the morning and spoke to me like I was a piece he was moving. The heat was closer to the surface now. He has had his hands in my life for 3 years, and I didn't know his name until 40 minutes ago. Mersquam. Elora was quiet for a moment. I understand, she said. Do you? Yes. She held his eyes in the dark of the car. I understand wanting to take apart something that manipulated you, that spent years treating you like you weren't a person making choices, but a variable in someone else's calculation. She paused. I was married to someone who did a version of that. Smaller scale, different mechanism, same essential act. She looked back at the notebook. I understand the anger. I'm asking you to think about what you do with it. The car moved through the city. He needs to be contained, Dominic said finally. Not by me. By people with the authority to contain him in a way that holds. She looked at him. Belluno has 50 years of relationships with people who regulate the financial structures Voss operates in, Dominic said. If Voss's operation gets exposed to those people, with documentation, with the Cyprus entity, with the Matteo connection, he doesn't just lose the Belluno play, he loses everything he's built. He paused. That's a more complete destruction than anything I do tonight in a hotel room. Elora held his gaze. You're sure? No, he said, but I'm choosing it anyway. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the notebook and wrote something and closed it. All right, she said. The hotel was on Park, the kind of address that cost what it cost because the address itself was the commodity. Harlan Voss was in a corner suite on the 9th floor. Marin had the room number, had been to the suite twice in the past 10 days for briefings, knew the layout and the single-occupant arrangement, and the fact that Voss kept no personal security because Harlan Voss had spent his entire career being the man no one had a reason to threaten, the man behind the men that people threatened, invisible by design. The invisibility, Dominic noted, was over. They went up in the service elevator, Dominic and Ronan and Marin and one other, and Elora, who was there because Dominic had stopped arguing about what she would and wouldn't do, partly because she was right that Marin's willingness to cooperate was connected to her presence, and partly because the thought of leaving her somewhere and walking into an unknown space felt worse than keeping her where he could see her. The corridor was empty. Marin knocked on the suite door, his knuckles on the wood, his face doing the correct thing, the face of a man returning from a completed assignment, controlled and professional. From inside, footsteps, the specific cadence of someone who is not alarmed, a pause, the peephole check, and then the sound of the lock. The door opened. Harlan Voss was 67 years old and looked like what he was, a financial architect who had spent 5 decades in rooms where money made its most important decisions. Silver hair, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a open collar shirt and dark trousers, the specific dishevelment of a man who had been working late and was expecting a routine debriefing. He was holding a glass of water in his left hand and had a tablet tucked under his right arm, and he looked at Marin with the expression of professional readiness, and then past Marin, and his face did something that Dominic had seen on a lot of faces over the years. The specific sequence of a man realizing, in real time, that the world he thought he was standing in had been replaced by a different one, and the replacement had been in progress for longer than he understood. Mr. Voss, Dominic said. Voss looked at him, at Ronan, at Elora, who was standing slightly behind and to the left, notebook in hand, the pencil already out, which was possibly the detail that Voss found most disorienting, the woman with the pencil. "You should invite us in," Dominic said. "The conversation we need to have is not a corridor conversation." Voss stood in the doorway for 4 seconds. The glass of water moved slightly in his hand. A tremor, small, quickly controlled. He was a man who had never been on this side of a reckoning, and his body was registering the novelty of it even as his mind tried to catch up. He stepped back from the door. They went in. Down. The suite was what it cost. Floor-to-ceiling windows with the park below, the kind of darkness that was actually the compressed light of the city seen from above, and spread across the desk and the coffee table, the specific organized chaos of a working operation. Printed documents, highlighted sections, a laptop with multiple windows open, a secure phone in a charging cradle. Dominic looked at the desk, at the documents. He moved to it before Voss could react and picked up the top sheet. It was a draft term sheet. His name was on it. His company's. The alliance structure with Belluno Group, restructured, with a third-party financial governance entity inserted at the top of the hierarchy. The name of the governance entity was a string of letters that meant nothing. The beneficial owner, in a footnote on the third page, was Harlan Voss. Dominic set it down. He turned and looked at Voss, who had sat down on the couch with the particular heaviness of a man whose legs had made a decision his pride hadn't authorized, and held the sheet up. "You were going to propose this to me," Dominic said. "After tonight, after I'd watched my alliance almost collapse, after Belluno was shaken, after you'd manufactured a crisis that made both of us feel like we needed a stabilizing partner." Voss said nothing. "And you built the entire mechanism using a young man's resentment of his uncle," Dominic said. "You gave Matteo Belluno the tools to destroy his own family's trust, and you wound him up and pointed him at the dinner and let him run." He looked at Voss steadily. "And you sent Marin to document it so you'd have the evidence that put Matteo away if Matteo ever became a problem for you. You're very thorough," Voss said. His voice had recovered something, not strength, but composure, the professional defense mechanism of a man who had survived many difficult rooms. "You got to this point faster than I expected." "My wife noticed Marin at dinner," Dominic said. Voss looked at Alara. She was sitting in the chair across from the couch, notebook on her knee, pencil moving. She was writing down the room layout and the documents on the desk and the sequence of what was being said with the same practice speed she'd used in every other moment of this evening, and she did not look up when Voss looked at her, which was, again, the exactly correct thing. "What do you want?" Voss said to Dominic. "The documentation. Everything. The Cypress entity structure, the Matteo communications, the Marin operational record, the draft term sheets, the access credentials you used for Belluno's internal network." Dominic walked to the desk and stood behind it. "Everything on this desk and everything on that laptop. Tonight. And in exchange you have until tomorrow morning to make arrangements that take you out of New York. After tomorrow morning, what I give to Belluno's regulatory contacts is no longer my decision." Voss looked at him. 67 years old, silver hair, the reading glasses still pushed up on his forehead at a slightly comic angle. He looked like someone's retired accountant. He looked like nothing. That was, Dominic understood, the entire point of him. "You're not going to—" Voss stopped, recalibrated. "You're giving me an exit. I'm giving you one night." Dominic held his eyes. "Because the damage you can do from a federal holding cell is less than the damage you can do if you're panicked and at large with access to your operation. I want you contained in a way that holds, and the cleanest version of contained is you making the rational decision that what you built here is finished and walking away from it before someone with a badge makes the decision for you." The room was very quiet. Voss looked at the desk, at the documents, at the laptop. He looked at Alara, who had stopped writing and was looking at him now with the same professional assessment she gave everything. Direct, without hostility, without performance. "Who are you?" he said to her, not rhetorically, actually asking. "Someone who noticed the wrong uniform," she said. Voss made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. "That's all." "That's enough," she said. He looked at the documents for another long moment. Then he set the glass of water down on the coffee table and put his hands on his knees and looked at Dominic with an expression that was not defeat. This was not a man built for the vocabulary of defeat, but was something like the specific pragmatism of a chess player who has counted the board and understood that the position is lost, and that continuing to play is a form of waste. The laptop, Voss said, has everything. The access credentials are in a folder called Administration. The Cyprus documentation is in a subfolder. He paused. The Matteo communications are encrypted. I'll give you the key. Dominic nodded to Ronan. Ronan moved to the desk. Voss looked at Dominic one more time. You understand this doesn't end here, he said. The structures I built, other people know they exist. Other people have interests in... That's tomorrow's problem, Dominic said. Tonight's problem is on that laptop. Voss looked at the floor. Ronan worked. The room was quiet, except for the sound of the laptop keys and the distant city below the windows and Alar's pencil moving in the notebook, catching the last pieces of an evening that had started as a performance and had become, somewhere in the hours between the dinner table and this suite on Park Avenue, something that neither of them had prepared for and neither of them could fully name yet. Dominic stood behind Voss's desk and looked out the window at the city below. The specific compressed darkness of it, the lights, the 8 million people doing what they did at this hour, unaware of the particular transaction occurring 9 floors above the park, and felt the weight of the evening settling into him the way exhaustion settled. Not suddenly, but all at once, as though his body had been holding it in suspension and had now decided the crisis was sufficiently resolved to let the accumulated cost arrive. His phone buzzed. Belluno. He answered. It's done, Dominic said. A pause on the line. Then Belluno said, Matteo. Contained by what we have on the laptop, he won't move against you. He knows what we can put in front of a federal prosecutor if he does. Another pause. And Voss. Leaving New York. Silence on the line for 3 seconds. Then Belluno said something in Italian that Dominic's partial understanding rendered as approximately, the devil you can see is better than the one you can't. The alliance, Dominic said. Still stands, Belluno said, if you want it. Dominic looked at Alara. She was looking back at him from the chair across the room, notebook closed now, pencil resting on top of it, her face showing the particular expression of someone who has been fully present for something difficult and is now in the space immediately after it, where the adrenaline is still metabolizing and the next decision hasn't announced itself yet. He made the decision. The alliance stands, he said, on the original terms. He hung up. Ronan pulled the laptop from the desk and looked at Dominic. We have everything. Then we're done here. Voss sat on the couch and said nothing and looked at the space where the laptop had been and began, visibly, the process of calculating what came next. The specific interior reckoning of a man who had just watched a decade of architecture dismantled in 4 hours. Dominic walked to the door. Ronan followed. The other man followed. Marin, who had stood at the edge of the room for the entire conversation, moved toward the door and paused. Marin, Dominic said without turning. Yes. You have the same window Voss has. A pause. Understood. Dominic walked into the corridor. Alara came out last. She pulled the suite door closed behind her with the careful quiet of someone who understood that the sound a door made when it closed was sometimes the last word in a conversation that words had run out of. They stood in the corridor. The hotel was quiet at this hour. The specific padded silence of a building that cost enough to muffle everything outside its walls. The corridor stretched in both directions, identical carpet, identical light, the anonymous luxury of a place designed to make every guest feel equally insulated from consequence. Dominic looked at her. She looked at him. She had the pencil in her hand. She'd been holding it, he realized, for hours. The same pencil from the first night, the one from behind her ear, the one that had been in her bag the whole time. She was turning it in her fingers, the small unconscious motion of someone who thought with their hands. You held, she said. Her voice was quiet and carried something that was not quite surprise and not quite relief. Barely, he said. Barely counts. She looked at the pencil. You made a different choice than the one that came naturally. You gave me the framework for it. She shook her head slightly. You gave yourself the framework. She stopped, turned the pencil once more. I just said what I saw. They stood in the corridor and the hotel was quiet. and outside the city was doing what the city always did, and between them was the specific gravity of a night that had taken two people who had agreed to perform a relationship and had put them through something real enough that the performance had become indistinguishable from the thing itself. "We should go," Ronan said from the elevator. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Alara put the pencil in her bag and looked at Dominic with the direct, unperforming eyes that had been the first thing he'd actually seen when she walked into his penthouse 6 days ago, and she said, "The contract was for one night." "Yes," he said. "The dinner was tonight." "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "So technically," she said, "I'm free." He looked back. "Technically," he said, "you are." Neither of them moved toward the elevator. And in the particular silence of a hotel corridor at 1 a.m, with the city below them and everything that had to be decided still undecided, Dominic Veretti, who had spent his entire adult life constructing the specific architecture of a man who needed no one, stood in the fluorescent light and understood that the most dangerous thing that had happened to him tonight was not Matteo Belluno or Carol Marin or Harlan Voss or the recording unit or the 2 a.m. phone call. It was the woman standing 3 feet away from him who had walked into his world carrying a battered sewing kit and had not, despite every reasonable opportunity, walked back out. "Alara," he said. She waited. "I don't know how to ask for this," he said, which was, possibly, the most honest sentence he had constructed in 11 years. She looked at him for a long moment. Her face did the small asymmetric thing that was her real smile. Not the performed one, not the social weapon, but the actual one. The one that came from somewhere she didn't usually let people see. "Yes, you do," she said. "You're just not used to the answer yet." He stood in the corridor and let that land. Let it sit in him the way true things sat. Not comfortably, not immediately, but with the specific gravity of something that had found its correct position and was not going to move. "Give me a week," he said. She looked at him. "For what?" "To figure out how to ask it right." She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she picked up her bag and walked toward the elevator where Ronan was holding the door with the particular careful expression of a man pretending he hadn't heard anything. "You have 5 days," she said without turning. "I have a production meeting on Thursday." He followed her. The week that followed had a quality that Dominic had no existing vocabulary for, which was itself the information. He knew the vocabulary of threat management, of financial restructuring, of the specific administrative work that followed a night like the one they'd had. The documentation from Voss's laptop went to Belluno's legal team within 48 hours, and the Cyprus entity was formally reported to 3 different regulatory bodies by the end of the week, and Matteo Belluno disappeared from his uncle's orbit with the quiet completeness of a man who understood that the alternative to a graceful exit was a documented one. Carl Marin was on a flight to Amsterdam within the window Dominic had given him, and if he landed there and kept his word about staying out of New York, that was the end of his part in the story. Harlan Voss left for Zurich, which was where men like Voss went when American operations closed, the specific financial ecosystem of a city that had been processing the cleanup of other cities' problems for a century. The alliance with Belluno was formalized on a Wednesday morning, in a conference room in Midtown with lawyers present and documents that represented 11 years of work. Belluno signed with his left hand, which was the hand he'd been using since a pressure injury in his 60s that had never fully resolved. A detail Dominic knew because Alara had put it in the briefing notebook in week 1, one of the 47 details she'd researched about the man before setting foot in his house. When Dominic signed, he thought about that. About the fact that his signature on a billion-dollar alliance was partly enabled by a woman who had sat in his penthouse for 2 days and asked the right questions. After the lawyers left, Belluno poured 2 glasses of something from a bottle he'd brought himself, which was the gesture of a man who understood the difference between a formal occasion and a real one, and slid one across the table. "Your wife," Belluno said. "She is not coming back to see me." "No," Dominic said. "That is a loss." The old man picked up his glass. "She is the kind of person who makes a room function better. You understand what I mean." Dominic understood exactly what he meant. "She is also," Belluno said carefully, "the reason you made the choices you made that night. Not the documents, not the information from Marin. The choices. He looked at his glass. I have been watching men in your position for 50 years, Veretti. The ones who survive, not just physically, but in the way that matters. The ones who are still something worth being at the end. They all have one thing in common. He paused. Someone who tells them the truth when the truth is inconvenient. Dominic said nothing. Don't lose that, Belluno said. Not as advice. As the specific weight of a man who had learned this lesson late and was choosing to say it directly to someone who still had time. They drank. He went to see her on a Thursday, not the production meeting Thursday. He waited until the following Thursday, because 5 days had become a week, and then a week, and 2 days, and he was aware, with the particular self-awareness of a man who had spent 11 years not examining himself and was now doing it with the uncomfortable focus of a late start, that he was finding reasons to wait, because the thing he needed to say was the hardest category of thing for him to say, and his instinct was to prepare for it the way he prepared for everything, exhaustively, until the variables were minimized and the outcome was as controlled as possible. The problem was that this was not a variable that could be controlled. He understood that. The understanding did not make it easier. It just made the waiting feel more like what it actually was, which was fear. He went on Thursday at 11 in the morning, which was when Ronan told him she was at her studio in the garment district. Ronan had not been asked to find this out and offered it at breakfast with the expression of a man who had simply noted a relevant piece of information and had no particular opinion about why it was relevant. The studio was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like industrial solvent and old wood and the specific density of a place that had been used for actual work for a long time. The elevator was the kind with a gate you pulled closed yourself. He rode it up alone and found the door with her name on it. Not her married name, her own name, E. Whitmore, in block letters on a hand-lettered card, and knocked. He heard her before she answered. The sound of movement, something set down, the specific stride of someone who moved with purpose even between tasks. She opened the door. She was wearing work clothes, dark trousers, a shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hair back with a clip instead of the pencil for once. There was a mark of chalk on her left forearm. She had reading glasses pushed up on her head. She was holding a measuring tape. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You're 2 days late," she said. "I know." "The production meeting was Tuesday." "I know. He stopped. This was the part he'd prepared for, and the preparation was, he now understood, completely useless, because the thing you couldn't prepare for was the specific reality of standing in front of someone and saying the true thing without the buffer of strategy or performance. I needed to know what I was asking before I asked it. She stepped back from the door. He came in. The studio was what it was, a working space. Racks of garments in various states of completion, a large cutting table covered in pattern pieces and chalk marks, and the small, useful debris of someone who made things with their hands. Sketches pinned to the walls, fabric samples hanging from a rod near the window itself facing north, the specific flat even light that designers and painters sought, the light that showed color accurately and cast no shadows that lied. She went to the cutting table and set the measuring tape down and turned to face him, arms crossing loosely over her chest. Not defensive, just finding a position, the body settling into its own consideration of the moment. "Say it," she said. He'd planned 3 different versions on the drive over. He'd planned the careful one and the direct one, and the one that acknowledged his own history and explained the context for why this was difficult. Standing here in the north light with chalk on her arm and the reading glasses on her head, all 3 versions seemed like what they were: management. The thing he did instead of the harder thing. "The contract is done," he said. "The money transferred 2 days after the dinner. Everything we agreed to is finished." He looked at her directly. "What I'm asking now has nothing to do with the contract. It's not a business arrangement. It's not strategic. It doesn't benefit my operation or secure an alliance or solve a problem I have." He paused. "It creates a problem I've never had before, which is that there's someone I don't want to stop seeing and I don't know what to do with that." The studio was quiet. Somewhere below them in the building, something mechanical was running, a sewing machine or a press. The low vibration of the place doing its work. "What kind of problem is that?" she said. Her voice was careful, not cold, careful. The voice of someone who had learned to be precise about this category of thing because imprecision in this category had cost her. The kind I can't manage, he said, which is, I've come to understand, the only kind that's real. She looked at him for a long time. He let her. He had learned, somewhere in the 6 days he'd known her, that she processed at her own pace, and that interrupting the processing was the wrong instinct. That the thing she was doing when she looked at you steadily and said nothing was not distance but the opposite of distance, the full application of her attention to the actual question rather than its surface. You have a world, she said finally. It's not a small world. It's not a world where a person can stay in it halfway. She held his eyes. I already did halfway for 5 years with a man who never fully let me into the parts of himself that mattered. I came out of that smaller than I went in. She let that sit for a moment. I'm not doing halfway again. I know. Do you? Yes. He moved to the cutting table, not to close the distance, just to shift out of the doorway, to settle into the room the way she'd settled into his penthouse on the first night, occupying the space as though he'd decided it was acceptable. I spent 11 years building walls specifically so that what's inside them can't be damaged. It's not a strategy I can dismantle. It's not something I can promise to eliminate. He put his hands flat on the cutting table. But the reason I built it was to protect things that mattered. And what I'm telling you is that you matter. He met her eyes. You have mattered since the moment you called me taller than expected and treated my penthouse like a difficult client's fitting room. She made a sound that was almost the real laugh. The small one, asymmetric, the one she couldn't perform. That's not, she started. I know it's not a speech, he said. I know it doesn't resolve the logistics. I know my world is what it is, and your studio is what it is, and there are 40 things between here and any version of this that actually works. He picked up a piece of chalk from the edge of the table, turned it in his fingers the way she turned the pencil. I'm asking you to be in the same room with those 40 things, with me, while we figure out which ones are actually problems and which ones are just things. She watched him turn the chalk. Then she reached across the table and took it from his hand. Not a reclaiming, a gentle taking, the way you took something from someone who'd been holding it long enough, and set it back in its place. I have a production meeting on Tuesday, she said. I know. And a fitting on Monday that runs until 6. All right. And I don't move into spaces. I need my own space. The studio, my apartment, those don't change. They don't change, he said. She looked at him. You understand what you're agreeing to? I understand I'm agreeing to whatever keeps you in the room, he said. The specifics are negotiable. That part isn't. The north light came through the window and lay across the cutting table between them, flat and even and honest, the light that showed things accurately. She stood on one side of the table and he stood on the other, and the studio was quiet except for the mechanical vibration from below and the distant street sound of the garment district going about its Thursday. She picked up the measuring tape from the table and coiled it in her hands, the gesture of someone who needed to do something with their hands when they were thinking. Then she said, There are things about my past you don't know yet. I know. I'm not easy to be around when I'm working. I disappear into projects. I forget to eat. I leave fabric on every surface. I've seen your sewing kit. I'm prepared. A pause. The man I was married to. There are days it comes back. Not him, specifically. The way I was when I was with him. Smaller. She looked at the measuring tape. There are days I have to actively remember that I'm allowed to take up space. Something moved in Dominic's chest that was not a business calculation and had no name he'd assigned to it yet. On those days, he said quietly, tell me. I'll remind you. She looked up. He held her eyes. You told me the first night that you were afraid of becoming invisible, of accommodating yourself until you disappeared. He kept his voice even, because the evenness was what this moment needed. Not softness, not performance, but steadiness, the thing he actually had to offer. I have spent 11 years making myself the most visible, most feared presence in every room I enter, and it has made me exactly as lonely as it sounds. He paused. I think between the two of us we might be able to figure out a middle distance. The measuring tape stopped moving in her hands. She looked at him for a long moment with the full application of her attention, the same look she'd given him in the penthouse on the first night when she was deciding whether the situation was what it appeared to be and whether she was the right person for it. The assessment look. The professional evaluation that also happened to be the most honest face she had. Then she set the measuring tape down. "All right," she said. "Just that." Just the word. The same word she'd used in the car on the way to find Voss, the same word she'd used when he told her to go left at the dinner table. The same word that he'd come to understand was, for Alara Whitmore, not a small word at all. It was the word she used when she'd evaluated something fully and decided to commit to it. The word that meant she was in. "All right," he said. The Belluno Alliance closed formally in the third week of October. With the documentation that Marin had provided and the supplementary structure that Belluno's legal team had rebuilt from the ground up, excising every element that Voss had contaminated. It was cleaner than the original terms. Belluno told Dominic at the final signing that in 50 years of doing business, he had never had a deal improved by the person who tried to destroy it, and that he considered this either a remarkable coincidence or evidence of a universe with a particular sense of humor, and that either way he was grateful. Dominic told him he'd pass the observation along to his wife. Belluno looked at him with the specific warmth of a 73-year-old man who had seen enough of life to know which things in it were actually worth the word remarkable. "Give her my regards," Belluno said, "and tell her the gown was extraordinary." But the question of Matteo resolved itself in the way these things resolved when the evidence was sufficient and the exposure was complete, not with violence or confrontation, but with the specific quiet of a man who understood that the floor had dropped out from under his position and that making noise about it would only accelerate the falling. Belluno handled his nephew directly, in a conversation that Dominic was not present for and did not ask about, because some accountings were private and the fact that they occurred was sufficient. What Dominic was told, through Ronan, was that Matteo had accepted a structured removal from the Belluno Group's active operations, with a settlement that was generous enough to mean he hadn't been destroyed, and specific enough that he understood the boundaries of his future. It was the kind of resolution that left everyone with something to lose if they reopened it, which was the most stable kind. Ronan reported this over coffee on a Tuesday morning with the particular understated satisfaction of a man who had survived a complicated week and was allowing himself to note that it had ended better than it might have. "Marin," Dominic said. "Amsterdam. He surfaced in a trade publication 2 weeks ago, listed as a consultant for a logistics firm." Ronan drank his coffee. "Low-profile work. He's not interested in being interesting anymore." "And Voss." Ronan set his cup down. "Zurich, as expected. His Geneva accounts are under review by the Swiss Financial Market Supervisory Authority. One of the Cyprus entity filings triggered an automatic referral." He paused. "He's not untouchable anymore. He's manageable." Dominic said nothing for a moment. He looked at the window, at the city, the same rain-prone glass and the same compressed darkness of it at this hour, and thought about the fact that 3 months ago he had stood at this window untouched and alone, and believed, without examining the belief, that this was the stable configuration of his life. "Ronan," he said. "Yeah." "The night before the Belluno dinner, when I said I was always in control, and I said that wasn't the same as handling it." Ronan looked at him. "I remember." "You were right," Dominic said. Ronan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know." And then, because he was Ronan Vale, and 11 years of working for Dominic Veretti had given him a very specific calibration for when to push and when to leave something alone. "She's good for you." Dominic picked up his own cup. "I know that too." "You gonna tell her?" "I tell her things," Dominic said. "It turns out I tell her most things." Ronan made the sound that was almost a laugh. "Look at that," he said. "Well, in November, Alara was in production on a show that ran 6 days a week for 3 weeks. And during those 3 weeks, Dominic learned things about himself that the previous decade had not offered him the opportunity to learn. Because the previous decade had been constructed specifically to prevent the conditions under which these things could be learned. He learned that he was capable of patience that was not tactical. He learned that a space with fabric on every surface was not an intolerable space. He learned that someone who forgot to eat when she was working required a person to remember for her without making the remembering into a transaction, and that doing this without calling attention to it was a form of care that he had not previously understood himself to be capable of, but apparently was. He learned that the particular silence of a person absorbed in their work was a different silence from the silence he'd built his penthouse around. Not the silence of the absence of other people, but the silence of two people sharing space comfortably, which was the hardest kind to construct, and once constructed, the kind you did not want to lose. He learned that the scar above his left eyebrow, which 3 federal indictments had described, and which he had stopped seeing in mirrors 20 years ago, was something she traced sometimes with her thumb when she was thinking about something else, an unconscious gesture of the kind that only happened when someone was completely comfortable, and that this gesture produced in him the specific feeling of a man who has been held at a distance from himself for a very long time and has unexpectedly been let back in. He didn't tell her that. He was working on it. The conversation about the wedding happened in December over takeout containers on the cutting table, which had become, without formal designation, one of their places. The studio after 9 p.m. when the building was empty, when Alara was in the wind-down phase of a production and allowed herself to stop moving, when the north light was replaced by the overhead work lights, and the room had the particular quality of a space at rest. "I want to be clear," she said, "that I'm not doing anything with a planner." Define anything. Any planner, any coordinator, any person whose job involves telling me what flowers should be present. She picked up a container. "I've spent 15 years managing the visual reality of other people's visions. I know how to put an event together." "I have no doubt," he said. "And the venue is mine to choose. The venue is yours. And the guest list is negotiable," he said. "Within reason. There are people whose absence would be noted." "How many?" 30, 40 at most. She looked at him. "Dominic, I've worked Broadway opening nights. 40 is nothing." He looked at her. "You're planning this already." "I've been planning it since the car ride home from the Belluno dinner," she said. I mean the general architecture of it, the idea of it." She set the container down and picked up, from the corner of the cutting table where it always ended up, the pencil. The original one from the first night, which had somehow migrated from her bag to the studio, and then to every surface she occupied regularly. "I had a thought about the dress." "You had a thought." "I've had several thoughts. There's a structural idea involving the shoulder line that I think is the most technically complex thing I've ever tried, and I've been sketching it for 3 weeks." She turned the pencil. "It's going to take time." "Take the time," he said. "It might be..." She paused. "It might be spring, if I do it right." Spring was 5 months away. He looked at her and thought about 5 months, and about the fact that the version of himself from 1 year ago would have found the concept of waiting 5 months for anything to be an operational failure, a loss of control, an unacceptable variable. "Spring," he said. "If I do it right," she said again. "Take the time," he said. "Do it right." She looked at him. The small asymmetric smile, the real one. "You're not going to argue." "What would I argue for? A faster version of something you'd make worse by rushing." She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her container and ate and looked at the sketches on the wall. The shoulder line drawing pinned near the window, 3 variations, annotated in the small, precise handwriting that was her technical language. And he watched her look at it with the face she wore when she was in the middle of something she was genuinely excited about, which was different from every other face she had, open in a way that the professional faces weren't. The specific openness of a person who had found the thing they were made to do and had never been talked into believing it was less than what it was. "I want to ask you something," she said without turning. "Ask." "At the dinner, when Belluno said you chose me." She turned then. He believed it. He believed you'd chosen someone outside your world because she was the right person, not the strategic person. She held his eyes. Was there a version of that was true? Even a small one, before everything else happened? The studio was quiet. The north light was off and the work lights were on, and the pencil was in her hand, and outside the garment district was doing its December thing, cold and busy and permanent. "Yes," he said. "When? When you took your shoes off in the rental office," he said, "and put on the flat ones. because you'd been carrying them all evening, and you put them on like it was the most practical decision in the world while I was trying to figure out how to intercept a man in a hotel, and you just—" He stopped. "You were completely yourself, in the middle of something that had nothing to do with your life and everything to do with keeping mine from falling apart. And you were just completely and entirely yourself." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's when," he said. She set the pencil down on the cutting table and looked at it, and then looked at him and said nothing for a while. And he let her say nothing because by now he understood that the silence was the processing, and the processing was the care she gave to things she took seriously. Then she said, "I want to keep the studio." "The studio stays," he said. "We've established this. I want it in my name. It's already in your name. I want it to stay in my name after." She met his eyes. I'm not going to be absorbed. I'm not going to become an extension of your life instead of a person with my own." "I know," he said. "Say it clearly. You are a person with your own life and your own work and your own name, and none of that changes." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking you to become part of my world. I'm asking if there's room in your world for some of mine." She was quiet. "There's room," she said finally. "There's been room since you put your hand on my bag and then let go of it." She picked up the pencil again. "That's when." He looked at her. She looked at him. Between them on the cutting table were takeout containers and chalk marks and pattern pieces and the small organized debris of a person who made things. Real things. Things that could be worn and moved in and seen from the back of a theater. And it was the most honest surface Dominic Veretti had put his hands on in 11 years. The wedding was in April. It was not the most formal event New York had seen that year, but it was the most specific one. Every detail chosen because it was the right detail, not the conventional one, and the distinction was visible in a way that people who attended could feel but not always articulate. She designed the dress herself, as she'd planned, and it was the shoulder line she'd been sketching since December, and it was the most technically complex thing she'd ever made, and she was right that it was, and wrong that it would take until spring. She finished it in March and spent 2 weeks not looking at it, and then looked at it and made 4 small adjustments, and then left it alone, because it was done and she knew it. The venue was a converted print factory in Brooklyn with north-facing skylights and exposed brick, and the specific quality of a space that had been used for actual work and carried that in its walls. There were flowers that Alara had chosen herself from a grower in the Hudson Valley, whose work she'd used for a show 3 years ago, and the arrangements were architectural rather than soft. And the light through the skylights was the flat, honest light she worked in every day. And nothing in the room was trying to look like something it wasn't. Salvatore Belluno attended. He sat in the 3rd row and held himself with the dignity of a man who had decided this was worth being present for. And when Alara came down the aisle, he watched her with the expression he'd worn in his study on the night of the dinner. The specific recognition of a capability he respected because he understood its cost. Ronan stood beside Dominic at the front of the room and did not make the sound that was almost a laugh, which was how Dominic knew the moment was actually getting to him. Alara walked in wearing what she'd built, and it was everything she'd wanted it to be. The shoulder line catching the skylight, the silhouette structured and fluid in the same moment, the dress of a woman who had spent 15 years understanding what it meant to put yourself into what you make. She was not performing anything. She was just arriving. Dominic watched her come. He had spent 41 years constructing the man who stood in this room today. The walls, the silence, the specific machinery of a person who had decided that control was the only reliable protection. And he understood, watching her walk toward him in the April light, that the machinery was still there and would probably always be there, because you didn't dismantle something built over decades simply by choosing differently. The choosing differently didn't eliminate the construction. It just meant the construction was no longer the whole answer. She arrived beside him. She looked at him with the direct, unperforming eyes. He looked back. "The dress is extraordinary," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "Now stop talking about the dress." He almost smiled. He almost, which was the real version, better than the performed one. The officiant began. Dominic listened and said the words he was supposed to say, and meant them in the way that only became possible when you'd been through enough with someone to understand that the words were not the promise. The words were just the public record of a promise already made in a hotel corridor at 1 in the morning, and in a car going through the city, and in a studio on a Thursday, and in every small moment in between, where two people who had agreed to perform something real had simply, quietly, stopped performing. When it was done, Alara turned to him with the pencil already in her hand. She had produced it from somewhere in the construction of the dress, which had, he would later discover, a small interior pocket at the left seam specifically designed to hold it, and looked at him. "You had a pocket made," he said. "I had a pocket made," she said, "for the pencil." "For the pencil." He looked at her. At the pocket he couldn't see. At the pencil from the first night that had been on every surface she occupied for the past 6 months, that had been in her hand in a rental car office, in a hotel corridor, in a study that smelled like old paper, and an April room full of honest light. "What are you going to write?" he said. She thought about it for a moment with the real expression. Not performing thinking, actually thinking. "Nothing today," she said. "Today I'm just going to be here." She put the pencil back in the pocket. He took her hand. Outside, the April city did what it did, living, grinding, surviving itself, producing the endless low-level insistence on continuation that had always been the engine underneath everything. The skylight above them held the light, and the light held the room, and the room held all of it, the 6 days that had become a life, and the two people who had agreed to perform something and had found, on the other side of the performance, the thing itself. Dominic Veretti had spent 11 years building the architecture of a man who needed no one. He had spent the last 6 months learning that the architecture was still there, and that someone had simply, without announcement, moved in. He found, standing in the April light with her hand in his, that this was not the loss of something. It was the only version of winning he'd ever encountered that felt like it was actually worth what it cost.